All right, everybody. Welcome to week 4 of technical writing with Mr. Measel. So this video lecture is going to be pretty short. I'm just going to do a brief overview of 2 articles today. The first article will be Audience Involved by Robert Johnson, and the second article will be An Introduction to Genre Theory by Daniel Chandler. What I don't want to do is go over all of the elements of the rhetorical situation in both of these, because I don't want to step on the toes of people who are actually making videos for these articles over this 2-week period. However, I do want to show you some things that you may or may not have noticed when you were analyzing these articles for yourself. So you may have noticed this past week in the discussions, I asked if you ever felt alienated or if you felt ignored by any kind of technical writing. And you'll notice that concept of being ignored actually comes up in this Robert Johnson article. And what he's trying to address is that, there's a lot of theory in technical writing. And we talk all the time about how we address audiences. But what we don't have enough of is audiences being part of that conversation about how we address audiences. And he's saying, how can we bring audiences more into that conversation, and how will bringing them into the conversation improve how we address them? To what degree is it ethical that audiences are so largely ignored in the discussion of how to address audiences? So beyond him telling you the basic argument of this article here in the abstract, I want you to look at the arrangement of this. So he's setting up this article. He's giving you a lot of background information to let you know what the current situation is, until you get down here to, it's on page 362. Right here. So this is where he actually starts to say, this is what I'm doing in this article. And you'll see this is where when you're talking about purpose and message, you see where these get combined. He's trying to at least inform you of something, right? But regardless of whether he's trying to inform you, trying to explain something to you, or trying to convince you, or trying to persuade you, he's trying to inform or convince or persuade you of this particular thing, or to do this particular thing. So the inform or convince or persuade is just that one action verb, and then the message is whatever it is that they're trying to inform, convince, or persuade you of. And here in this article, he's going to try and convince you, he's actually going to inform you and then trying to convince you that these things are true. What I want to add to this long history of audience theory, he wants to show you that integrating audience into the discussion of audience challenges the role and power of writers as it encourages a reciprocal and participatory model of writing, unlike that usually explained in general composition and rhetoric studies. Okay, so he's telling you here what his article is going to do. He's giving you a little bit of his thesis. Okay, so then you want to ask yourself, does he actually address this thesis in the rest of his article? And you want to ask yourself, does the article do what it said it was going to do? Okay, so in order to convince you that this truly is the current state of technical writing, he gives you a literature review here. And in this literature review, he is citing a lot of people who agree with him. He's citing the sources from where he got this information. And what he's been doing is he's been reading what other scholars in the field have been saying, and he's using their claims to sort of set this background up and say, okay, here's the status quo. Here's where we are right now, so that he can say, okay, I have a role in this conversation. Here's where I fit, and here's where we can move forward. Okay, so if you look at page 364, and actually starting at the bottom is 363, he moves from this literature review, right, back into this statement. Here is what my article is going to do. So here's what everybody else has had to say, right? Here's now what my article is doing. Okay, I examine instances. I couch my argument. I ground my discussion. Secondly, okay, this is where he moves into what is going to be is going to be the persuasive element of his argument. So now that he's convinced you of these other ideas, he's saying, after that, I'm going to show you that it's imperative that we demonstrate how users produce knowledge if we are able to make them viable players. And you'll see that later in his article, he actually starts talking about activities that will enact this theory and allow you to put it into practice and allow you to put it to the test. I want you to see the appeals to logos here. So he's appealing to definition. He talks about different definitions of technology, right? If you look on 365, he's going to talk to you about the determinist view of technology, and then he's going to turn around on 366 and talk to you about the construction or the social construction as views of technology. And why is he doing this? Well, essentially what he's doing is he's pitting two theories against each other so that you can see the context in which this argument is surfacing. And you can also weigh his ideas against these pre-existing ideas. And you can see not only where he got the roots of his ideas, but also what it is that he's trying to reject, what he's trying to stand out against when he says, okay, we can't be deterministic about the future of technical writing and our interactions with our audiences. We have to let the audiences influence. We have to let audiences influence the technical writing, which is part of this social constructionist theory. You see, when he gets down to this section of usability, when he's talking about usability, I want you to see that again, he's relying heavily on these appeals to logos with definition. Spends a long time here defining what he means by usability within a particular context. So this is all definition and description, and he's setting you up for his discussion of usability because it exists within a particular context. We have these terms that we throw around in theory, and especially in scholarly articles. And when we go into the ballgame knowing that there are lots of different ways to define a term and that it can really be up for debate, which is, to be honest with you, most of the time, what we do is we take a term and we say, okay, this is what this term means in this context. This is what it means for this article. This is how I'm using it. And it's totally okay to do that. And it's just part of the qualification process when you're qualifying your argument. I want you to notice that despite the fact that there is a persuasive element to this article that shows up again in the conclusion, there is also a section of this article that is purely technical writing, and it comes up when he discusses the case study. Okay, so let's pop on over to the Chandler article, An Introduction to Genre Theory. That's about what it is too, because this article introduces you to a whole lot of theories about genre, and it doesn't end up being able to go into too much depth about any one of them. Yet it is still a 13-page article before you even get to the references section. And what does that say? It says that there are a lot of different theories about genre. This is meant to do two things. One, you should probably feel a little bit overwhelmed when you're reading this. Number two, hopefully this will help you feel relaxed about any kind of anxiety you have about genres and about like accurate definition of genres. Because the truth is, of all sets of ambiguous categories, genres are ridiculously, like, probably some of the most ambiguous. They're ridiculous. We can't agree on how to define them. Let's just talk about what some of these different notions of genre definition are. I love this where Chandler says on page 2 that it's a theoretical minefield, because it's absolutely true. Okay, so let's just look at this first theory that's over here on page 2, right? Let's get the statement about the theoretical minefield. Conventional definitions of genres tend to be based on the notion that they constitute particular conventions of content. Okay, such as themes or settings. So we've talked about content and arrangement and design. So is it true that we can just determine that a genre based on what content exists in that piece of media, regardless of how it's designed, regardless of how it's arranged? Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But I would say that for me, definition of genre is a lot more nuanced than that. For example, so a dark comedy for me has a very different tone than an actual horror film, right? But if I am just looking at the content that's in that, especially maybe just visual content, then I might be finding that it looks a lot more like a horror film. I might want to define it as a horror film, or even say, well, there are more horror elements in here than there is like a humorous dialogue. So I think that this is going to have to be a horror film. I don't like those kind of determinist genre definitions, but luckily for me, I'm not alone. There are a lot of people who say, I don't agree with that. There's who say there are a lot of different ways to define genre, or just have a different way to define genre. So, what about hybrid genre? That's where we would get this notion of a dark comedy, right? The fact that you can have something that's both a love story and it's there to make you laugh. That's where we get rom-coms. You can have rap rock for anybody who actually likes that kind of thing. I'm not really a fan of it at all, but unfortunately, it does happen. Okay, so let's go down here. We got this. We've got this notion that how we define a genre depends on what we're trying to do, right? We have Steve Neal here saying that genres systematize media rather than media systematizing genres. We have this sort of more liquid idea of genres interacting with media. We have ideal types, which is sort of correlates with the notion of touchstones in literary criticism. Touchstones is a notion from like Matthew Arnold, right? That we have these ideal representations or ideal examples, right, of genres that anything within those particular genres should try and strive to be like, right? Because those particular examples or those particular ideal types, they have qualities about them that must show up, right? According to this theory, that must show up in new pieces of work in order for those new pieces of work to qualify as being legitimate in that genre, or to qualify as being a very high quality within that genre. And then you get this notion of being ahistorical, and this is saying, that like regardless of whether something is 1,000 years old or whether we're making it now, it sort of stands. Not only do things stand the test of time, but they also sort of stand out against time, because time isn't something that destroys them. Their quality is not defined by their kairos or by their timeliness. Their quality is defined by these sort of touchstone elements that are in them that make them great, as opposed to a historical context. And then we have here what I hope my work would be, which is this notion of genre-defying texts. So traditionally, literary and film critics in particular have regarded generic texts, by which they mean formulaic texts, as inferior to those which they contend are produced outside a generic framework. And this fits in line with the idea that if you keep passively taking in particular genres, you may stop paying attention to what their content is, or paying close attention to what their content is, or paying conscious attention to what their content is. You start to sort of absorb rhythms and absorb information without thinking about it, and it makes you both passive to things that you wouldn't necessarily normally be passive to if you were conscious about it. It makes you uncritical of that media and other media around it. It makes you uncritical of your own predictive faculties. And if you want to read more about how repetitive exposure to one kind of genre can lead to passive consumption, go ahead and just take a look at this paragraph here at the top of page 7. See a couple of politically oriented theories. See on here, page 7, cultural capital. Right. You see a couple of socially oriented theories. So you have this notion, the cultural capital. define genre, and then back on page 5, you have this notion here that genre is defined by the relationship between authors and audiences, and I think both of these are important to consider when we're thinking about Robert Johnson's notion of audience involved.